Have you guys ever noticed how complicated relationships are? You know, I think about just my personal life. I think about Jill and I and our marriage, and I think about my boys and they're, dating and their dating relationships and all the different ups and downs and, just the complications. I think about my good friend Jordan and his wife. They like Bachelor and Bachelorette. You guys like those shows? No, you're not into them. Well, if you did like them, there's a lot of drama and a lot of complicated things in those shows. I mean, you watch that and you're like, goodness, relationships are complicated. But for me personally, relationships on the other side of me with my boys, with Jill and I, books that I read, things that I do a lot of research on relationships. And I just over and over and over, I think that universal truth, regardless if you're a follower of Jesus or not, at the end of the day, I think just relationships are complicated. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, just the other day, for real, Jill and I were fighting about a potato, not a bag of potatoes, not the cost of a potato, not 7 potatoes, no, one single potato. Like we were going back and forth and we were squabbling about. And in fact, this week we talked to our marriage counselor about it. And it was like our marriage counselor was like, present a stressful situation. I'll say, well, let's talk about the potato. So we talked about it. Obviously, it wasn't about the potato. But it was one of those things after just deconstructing it, thinking about it. I just sat there and I thought to myself, wow, relationships, they're just complicated. Or perhaps you've been on the other side of someone, or maybe you've heard something like this, that in a relationship, she's saying to you, hey, this Christmas, let's not get one another gifts. Like, hey, we've spent a lot of money this year, and we've bought each other gifts. Let's just not do that. And then because you're trying to be an active listener, you repeat that back. You're saying, so what I heard, we're not going to buy one another any gifts for Christmas. Yes, that's what I'm telling you. Christmas morning happens and you know exactly where this is going. She gets you a gift. You don't give her a gift. She looks at you and was like, what are you thinking? I'm so hurt. And you're sitting there going, are you kidding me? I thought. And it's just, you say to yourself, man, relationships, they're complicated. I mean, there's so many examples of this. I mean, maybe you're in a dating relationship, you're in a marriage relationship, and the other person expects you to have this like Jedi mind reading capability. In other way, they don't share any of their needs. They don't share their desires. They don't share their wants. They just expect you to figure it all out, to have that Jedi mind reading capability. And then when you don't figure it out, they're like, man, you just don't get me. You don't understand me. And you're like, are you kidding me? If you would talk to me, it would be helpful. But the point is, you sit there and you say to yourself, man, I'm just telling you, when it comes to relationships, dating relationships, marriage relationships, pick any kind of love relationship, at the end of the day, a universal truth that I think we cannot escape is the fact that relationships, they're just complicated. So guys, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited and looking forward to this brand new series that we're kicking off today called Love Handles. Now, when you see this, maybe the topic's a little bit confusing and you thought, well, if we're going to talk about love handles, Buck, are we going to talk about these things right here? Which, by the way, we're not. And should I just leave this picture up here a little bit longer? No. Hey, so we're not talking about that. But the thing we are talking about is far more serious and far more practical and helpful, is that relationships, they are complicated, guys. And we and I, as a church, we want to do everything we can to help, to step in and just say, here's some really practical things. In fact, over the next several weeks, here's where we're going. is that every week at the end of our time, we're going to give you a love handle, which is a principle. And this principle, I think, is going to be universally helpful. If you're dating, if you're married, if you're single, if you're thinking about one day getting married, it's just a principle that helps us take a step in our love relationships. It actually helps our love relationships get better. It helps us connect better in intimacy. It helps us have conflict better. It helps us understand one another's needs and desires at a greater level. It helps us understand sex. I mean, sex is so layered and complicated. Over the next several weeks, at the end of every part, we're going to give you a love handle, a principle that I think is going to be so helpful for every single one of us. And then we're going to give you a very practical question. And this question is something you can put on your phone. This question is something you can give to a friend. You can talk about in your small group. And it just helps unpack, kind of deconstruct a principle that I think if we're willing to take steps, if we're willing to kind of be brave and embrace these principles and ask ourselves these questions, it really is going to help us thrive in our relationships. And that's ultimately what we think God desires for you and God desires for me, that God desires these relationships that are healthy, that we thrive, that we're known, that we're loved, and that we experience that connection and that intimacy. So I am so looking forward to where we're going over the next several weeks. Now, today what I want to do is I actually want to talk about the foundational love handle. It's something that I think, again, it's so important for all of us, if you're a follower of Jesus or not, but it's something that is so core, so central, so foundational to love relationships. So I think we've got to start here. Now, you may ask, well, what is this foundational love handle that we're going to talk about today? Well, several weeks ago, I was hanging out with my son, Michael. Michael's in 8th grade, and he is 14 years old. And we were talking, and we were, driving down the road talking, and he was like, Dad, what were you, Mom, up to today? And I said, well, we were with our marriage counselor. And again, that's the second time I've mentioned a marriage counselor, so if you're concerned about me, that's fair. But I'll tell you what I told him. He's like, oh, Dad, tell me about that. And I said, son, the reason why Mom and I see a marriage counselor is because it's kind of like, your car, it's running good, but you want to fine tune it. You want to maybe change the spark plugs, maybe add a little bit of horsepower, do these kind of things. And because he and I work on cars, he's like, it made sense to him. And he's like, oh, yeah. I go, that's pretty much all Mom and I are doing. We're just kind of looking under the hood, seeing if there's anything we can clean up, seeing if there's any tension points. And it's just so incredibly helpful. So he's like, oh, that's awesome. So he goes, Dad, what are you guys learning? What did you guys learn about? And I said, well, son, in fact, I'll show you my notes. And I go, here's what we learned about right here. So these are literally my notes. And if you've come to Northpoint a while and you're like, Buck, you seem to be random sometimes. Well, now you understand why I'm random. I mean, it's kind of how my brain works, right? But anyways, at a very high level, I was talking, Michael, we were learning about the brain and how it works in attachment and connections. And I said we were learning how the eyeballs are like extensions to your brain and like body language, if you're smiling and delighting, how you feel so much more safe and vulnerable. And he's like, oh, that makes sense. And I'm like, but if your face is stoic in a relationship, you kind of like, am I safe with you? Am I not? Or if your face is angry, you're like, you're not safe. And I want to kind of run, or I don't want to be vulnerable. And he was like, oh man, Dad, that makes so much sense. So we're talking. And we had a great conversation in the car. And then he says this to me. He says, Dad, here's the deal. When I get married and have kids like you and Mom, would you remind me to do what you and Mom are doing? It just seems so helpful. And I said, Michael, I'll definitely do it. I'll remind you. But I said, better yet, I said, here's the thing. The greatest piece of advice I could give you for your personal life and the greatest piece of advice I could give you for any of your future love relationships is, Michael, the greatest gift you could give yourself in your relationships is the healthiest version of you. It's the healthiest version of you. That will make you as a man feel so much more alive if you can give yourself the gift of the healthiest version of you. And any of your future love relationships, your dating relationships, marriage, any relationship, you want those to thrive, son? He's like, yeah, man, you got to give those relationships the healthiest version of you, which he naturally asked me, well, Dad, what does that mean? And I just looked at him and I said, well, oftentimes we get confused on what's going to make us happy and what's going to make us feel alive and what's going to make our relationships feel happy and what's going to make our relationships feel alive. And we think it has everything to do with the outside. In other words, I said, Michael, we think, if I just get that certain kind of education, if I get that certain kind of job, if I get that certain title, if I make that certain amount of money, and that certain amount of money allows me to have that kind of bank account and buy those kind of things, and if we can get that kind of house, and then we can get those kind of cars, and if we have those kind of cars, then we can get a second house and a third house, then we can get the beach house, then we can get the mountain house, and then on top of that, we can get a boat, because that's going to make me happy, it's going to make our family happy, it's going to make all our kids happy, so we're going to get the boat, and then we're going to go on this kind of vacation, that kind of vacation, because I've always dreamed of those kind of vacations. So I'm going to work and work and work and do everything I can to go on those kind of vacations. And eventually we're going to get a yacht, because if you really make it in life, you get a yacht. I actually didn't say that, but I just thought of that. I'm just like, and that's a little bit dramatic. I didn't talk to Michael that way in the car, But I just was like, those are all the things we think. And I looked at him and I just said, those are fine. All those things are wonderful. If you want those things, great. I say, here's my point, son. You can have all those things and work your whole life for that stuff and be absolutely miserable, unwell, and unhealthy right here. Said, son, your best chance at being fully alive as a man, your best chance at giving the greatest gift to your future person you're going to date, the future, marriage, if you're going to get married, your greatest chance for those relationships to thrive, son, is to give yourself and to give those relationships the healthiest version of you. Jesus says something almost on par with that, very similar. In Mark chapter 8, I love what he says. Look at this. He says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world? You work so hard, spend so much energy on that, and forfeit his soul. In other words, you got everything you've always wanted, all the stuff that you thought was going to make you so happy and accomplish all these things and make your marriage or make your dating, or you got the six pack, you got all these things. Again, nothing's wrong with those, but man, Jesus' point is, what about this? This is far more important to the health and the quality of your relationships and your personal happiness and joy and purpose in life. It's about this. Jesus knew this. He loves you. And Jesus says, man, when this is right, man, so many other things are right, aren't they? When this is right, you have that security. When this is right, your identity is strong. You're not wondering about who you are. You're not putting your identity in your bank account. You're not putting your identity in your titles and your businesses and your accomplishments and your book you wrote, whatever it is. Like at the end of the day, it's like, no, my identity is so secure because my soul is good. When your soul is good, you are more humbled and patient than you've ever been. When your soul is good, you have that incredible peace that truly does transcend. It's not the anxiety of tomorrow, the worry of tomorrow, trying to control all the outcomes. God's going to deal with that. Are you kidding me? He is far bigger than me. Who do I think I am? I'm just going to rest in today. There's so much peace. And because there's security, because your identity is firm, you have that humility and you have that patience and you have that peace. You can be far more curious. I'm so curious about you. Hey, I'm curious. I want to discover more about you. I want to learn more about what you would think about this. Hey, what do you see in this situation? How would you handle this situation? Hey, what is it like on the other side of me? Hey, I rarely get reflection points, but man, I'm so curious now. My soul feels so good. I would love to know, is there anything I'm doing that's breaking trust? Is there anything I'm doing that you would do differently? Because maybe you see the world and you see me differently. Aren't those the very ingredients of what makes relationships thrive? That security, that peace, that patience, that identity that you're not questioning, and with whatever the winds of feelings of today or next week or next month or whatever those things are. Isn't that what gives you freedom in your personal life? See, Jesus was on to something. He knew it. Why are you spending so much energy on the external when the internal determines so much about what you long for in life? And not only what you long for in your personal life, but your relationships. I mean, what Jesus understood is that when it comes to relationships, the health of our relationship doesn't move from the outside in, but from the inside out. I mean, are you kidding me? Hey, my marriage, I got to make it better, so I got to get the boat. Hey, if I get the Ferrari, hey, if I get the yacht, back to the yacht, whatever it is. Like, hey, if I get dating relationships are going to be great. Then I'm going to get the girl. Then I'm going to get the guy. No, Jesus says, man, you'll fool yourself. You'll chase the wind if you go that direction. And yes, those things are important. Don't hear me dismiss those things. That's an important aspect of life. But when I'm talking about your freedom and you being more alive as an individual, when we're talking about our relationships and what is foundational, where we have to start in this discussion, not these practical tools over here, but we have to start with something so central. Jesus understood it starts from the inside, not the outside. Because the principle at play that Jesus fully understood is that when your soul is good, your relationships are good. Now, this is not a guarantee because, the other person on the other side of you has all the freedom in the world to do what they want to do. But in order to handle what they may choose and may choose not to do, in order to be there, to be present, in order to love and do what love requires of you, in order to be secure, in order to receive the things that they can actually give you, has everything to do with what's happening right here. So let me just check in, because I so desire for myself, all of us, to thrive in our love relationships. Can I just ask, how's your soul? How's your personal soul? What's happening in here? Is it well in here? You may say to me, well, Buck, I don't even know how to answer that question. I mean, that's a little bit confusing. That's hard. It's mysterious. Like the idea of a soul, I don't even know how to quantify that. I don't know how to define that. You may even ask the question, like, what is a soul? And that's a completely human and fair question because the soul is notoriously difficult to define. You need to know that volumes and volumes have been written on the soul. What is it? How do you grow it? How do you develop? What is the soul? So much has been written on this soul. So guys, I don't have time to give you a comprehensive overview of the soul. We could take months and months and months talking about that. But I do want to give us a little bit of direction and insight into the soul. Like, what is it? And how can we begin to develop it and grow it? Because, man, it has such a connection and foundation to the future of our love relationships. So when it comes to the soul, a couple things that come to my mind as I think about the ancient Hebrew scriptures, it talks about the soul all the time. And the words that are synonymous with the soul are mind and spirit and heart. You hear those words, interchangeably used all the time when it's talking about the soul. The soul is that thing, that place that you have security or insecurity. The soul is the place where, you have joy and contentment, or you have a little bit of desperation and hopelessness. The soul is the place that you feel completely fulfilled on the inside. You're like, I feel so fulfilled. Or you feel all this anxiety and worry. That's the soul. And the thing is, we talk about our souls all the time. We don't know we're talking about them, but we do. If you have a bad day at work, or maybe your boss, or a bad day at school, or your teacher, or your coach, and you're like, I'm so frustrated. You come home and you say words like this. You say, man, my work is killing me. My boss is killing me. School's killing me. My teacher, my coach, they're killing me. What are you talking about? You're talking about that anxiety, that frustration, that anger. And here, you're talking about your soul. And conversely, if you love going outside, like you love the outdoors and you love creation, like my good friend Jeremy. Jeremy loves getting outside. He loves talking about, he tells me all the time, Buck, I'm jogging outside, and he loves all his trails, and he loves taking pictures of stars. He always is showing me his star pictures. He's like the star man. And every time he goes on vacation, he's always doing some outdoor vacation. And when he comes back to work, he doesn't live with me. When he comes back to work, and I talk to him, I'm like, Jeremy, how was your vacation? He says this all the time. He says, Buck, I felt so alive. I felt so alive. What is he talking about? He's talking about his soul. That's the invisible part of you. That's the inside of you. It kind of feels like air on the inside. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to articulate. It's hard to define. And if you're a God follower, if you're a Jesus follower, you've heard before about where the soul came from. You understand where it originated, and that the soul originated in the very beginning. In the very beginning, it says this, as we go back to Genesis, that the Lord formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. In other words, in the very beginning, God created a form. And that's important to understand. That he created, there's the human right there. There's the human body. There's the lips, the hips, and the fingertips right there before his very eyes. But it wasn't alive. And God breathed into that human form. He breathed life into humanity. And what's interesting is in the Hebrew language, the word for breathe is the exact same Hebrew word as soul, that he breathed the soul into your life. And here's what's really important for you to know. He didn't do that with the animals. He didn't do that with the trees in creation. He did that with humanity. And it's one of the reasons why if you come to Northpoint a lot, we say all the time, we say you are made in the image of God, that you have intrinsic worth and value, that every day of your life you can wake up and go, I have incredible worth. I have so much value. I am beautiful. I am enough. You can look at yourself in the mirror and say those words, not because of some religious, psychology, but because God breathed his very life into you. That's where your soul comes from. If you're a follower of God or a Christ follower. I love what King David, the most famous king of Israel, how he articulates and gives us some description about the soul. He says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me blesses his holy name. You know what I love about this? Is David says, if I had to describe what's happening when my soul is expressing air to the one who gave me life, he says, this is the way I would express it. My soul is all that is within me. That's how he would describe it. Or you could even say a soul is the center of who I am. It's everything in here, everything that I'm feeling, everything that's going on the inside. It's that invisible part of you that, again, if you're a God follower or a Jesus follower, this is the part of you that you believe lives not only in this life and gives you life in this life, but this is the part of you that lives for all of eternity. So as you think about that, that's just a very kind of surface level kind of step into what is a soul. Let me ask you again with that information. How's your soul? How are you doing in here? What's happening in all the parts on the inside of you? And can I ask you this question? Are you developing and nurturing a healthy soul? Because again, at the end of the day, it's the greatest gift you can give yourself to look yourself in the mirror, to walk around with an incredible amount of confidence. Not that it's somehow this confidence that comes from nowhere, but you have this steadiness, this objective confidence of your security, on your identity, on your value and your worth. And that not only frees you and allows you to experience what God created you to experience, but that's also the key to allow your relationships, love relationships to thrive. It's a fair question. Are you developing intentionally and nurturing your soul? I think a fair pushback would be, well, Buck, I don't even know how to do that. Is there anything practical that you can help me understand to even answer the question, how's my soul? Can you give me some handles? Can you give me some direction? Can you give me a guide to answer that question? And the good news is I can absolutely do that. In fact, a book that I would highly recommend that's really helpful in this conversation is by Judah Smith called How's Your Soul? It's a very practical book. It's a very helpful book. And in this book, Judah gives us 4 very specific things that really help serve as like a guide to develop your soul, to nurture your soul, to grow your soul, to begin to understand if somebody ever asks you the question, how's your soul? Well, that's a hard question to answer, but these 4 things really allow us to have something to hold on to go, oh, now I understand what that looks like. So guys, here's what we're gonna do. Over the next few minutes, I'm gonna take some time. It's gonna be a lot of information, but I think you guys can handle it. And I'm gonna talk about the 4 things that Judah shares. I think these are really helpful and insightful. And this is not gonna feel like a relationship series for the next few minutes. But I'm telling you, we've got to go here because this is the foundation to what allows our love relationships to thrive is what's happening in here. So we have to take some time, and I think we have to start this discussion right here. So what are the 4 things that actually serve as guides to help us develop and nurture our soul? Well, this starts at the very beginning, right after God breathed the soul into the first human being. And then look at what happens right after that. It gives us our first guide. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. Now, this is important because remember, God creates the first human beings and he creates a perfect environment for their souls to flourish. And the first thing he does in this creation with the soul is he says, I'm going to create these wonderful things for you that are good, these wonderful things for you that are pleasing, and they're for your benefit. It's an environment for you. These trees, look at all of them, the bananas and the fruits and the peaches and the raspberries. I love raspberries. I mean, raspberries were from the very beginning. He created it all. And it's like a good father that says, man, look at everything I created. Go enjoy. These things are for you. They're for your benefit. In other words, if you were to synthesize that into what is an observation that the environment that's conducive for our soul, you would say, if your soul is going to thrive, you've got to rest. Rest is imperative for you. Rest is imperative for me. That God created these things for your good. God created these things so you could rest. God created these things for your pleasure. So what is rest? What's that idea of resting? Well, if it's good, if they're your pleasure, if they're, for your benefit, that means, hey, I've got to pause. I've got to go on a walk. That's restful. I've got to take a nap. That's restful. I've got to do something fun, maybe go play golf, go to the lake. I mean, those things are restful for your soul. I've got to go and sit down with friends and have a good glass of wine or some high-calorie food. Not every day, but have some high-calorie food, Enjoy some carbs. It's okay. It's that idea of ceasing from doing the necessary. It's always about, well, what about the outcome of tomorrow, next week, next month? What? Is God not big enough to handle that? Cease from doing the necessary. Your soul is designed to rest. Now, sometimes that gets difficult, especially if you're raised in church, because one of the questions that I think is an important question to ask and then be self-reflective about is the question of what comes to your mind when you hear the word God. If I said, what comes to your mind when you hear the word God? For a lot of us, it's not rest. What comes to our mind is the law of God. It's like, hey, get busy. Thou shalt not, thou shalt. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What the heck are you doing? Obey, obey, obey. Go, go, go. We think this about God. This is perhaps why we push against religion. No. God created you, designed you. It was good, pleasing, pleasure, rest. For your soul to thrive, for it to develop and grow, you've got to rest. And I love that he did this first. This was the first thing for your soul. Judah gives us some insight. He tells us why God made this first. He said, rest is first because God is first. A restless soul is a soul that thinks it's in control and needs to take care of everything. If we do not rest, we are trying to be our own God. We have to remember that when we rest, God does not. When we sleep, God does not. And when we cease working, God does not. And I just have a question. Do you actually believe that? Do you believe God is always working? Do you believe God is for you? See, one of the big themes of all the scriptures is the paradoxical nature of God. You see this theme throughout the entire scriptures. God says, lose your life, surrender your life, and you actually find life. Paradoxical. Rest. I'm the God of tomorrow, the day after, next week, next month. I know exactly what you need for you to thrive, for your relationships to thrive. But today, you need to rest. You need to enjoy. You need to have some fun. In other words, one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself for the healthiest version of you, for your soul, is rest. Because when you're rested, doesn't it have profound implications to your relationships? When you're rested, you have far more margin to be patient, to listen. When you're rested, you have far more margin to be able to be curious. You're like, hey, I've got some energy here. Hey, can we talk about you? Hey, tell me, how's your day going? I'd love to know how you think about this. There's far more patience and curiosity. When you're rested, you're far less grumpy. Or maybe that's just me. I tell my boys all the time, I'm like, man, I'm so exhausted. I'm grumpy, boys. I'm grumpy. Just be on the lookout, And part of that is because I haven't rested well. Rest is imperative for your relationships to thrive, for your soul to thrive. God created it as a gift for you, a gift for me, and a gift for our soul. That's first and foremost. That's the guide. Secondly is the question, what else? It continues. Let's go back to the very beginning. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. That in the very beginning, God gave you and me a responsibility. And it's in the responsibility that God gave us that our soul thrives. Then the very beginning, before sin came into the world, and this is really important to know, before sin came into the world, did you know that work, responsibility, whatever that may be taking care of the kids, that may be, going to a certain job, that may be volunteer, whatever the work is, whatever that responsibility is. But did you know before sin entered the world, that's where meaning was found. That's where your purpose was found. That's where your identity had confidence, was given confidence, was found in being responsible. I mean, this is why so many times you hear, or this is why, so many times today you hear people over-identify with work. I mean, sin has come in the world is now broken, judgment's over the world. And now we begin to over-identify with our work. And we're like, man, you work all the time. I mean, I think about my mom. My mom over-identified with work. My goodness, she would work 2 or 3 days in a row, literally without sleeping. She wouldn't sleep. She would just work and work and work. That was my mom. She over-identified with work. And when I would talk to my mom about this, say, Mom, why do you do this? Like, you're always gone. You're always late to pick me up from practice. I miss these parties. I miss these times of, being with my friends because you're always working. She's like, Buck, I just feel so alive. Buck, I feel so meaningful. I feel so purposeful. I feel like it's just something. If you've ever been on the other side of a workaholic or somebody who identifies with work far too much, what do they say about it? They say the exact same thing. What are they talking about? They're saying, my soul feels purpose. My soul feels alive. I have meaning in here. They're talking about something God designed them for. It's to be responsible. God created you and I, created our souls not only to rest, but to step in to our responsibility. Now, you may hear that and you may go, Buck, I totally disagree. Because I think my soul would be at rest. My life would be so great if I had zero responsibility. That's perhaps what you think, right? And I'm not going to argue with that, but I would just say this. You can do that for maybe a week, maybe a month. But after a week or a month, what's going to happen? You know this. Your soul's going to get restless, isn't it? There's going to be an anxiety that sets in. There's going to be a depression that sets in. There's going to be a little bit of an identity crisis that begins to set in. There's going to be this like, what's going on? You were designed to step into those responsibilities. I love what King Solomon, one of the most famous kings of Israel, he says this, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. That whatever your responsibility is, if it's at home, if it's serving in the community, if it's at a job, whatever it is, to do it with all your might. Because when you don't, and when you pull back and you're doing it halfway and hey, I could be far more responsible here, I could be far more responsible here, and you're not, you feel it, don't you? And you bring that to relationships. Sometimes it feels like you're on the other side of somebody who has an identity crisis. And oftentimes you can point it back to a responsibility. That they're either neglecting a responsibility or they're not leaning into the responsibilities and doing it with all of their heart. It's connected to your soul. That when God designed your soul, God designed you and me. Our soul's at rest, where our soul is developing when it's at rest, and our soul is developing when we're leaning into our responsibilities. The third guide to develop and nurture our soul is going back to the beginning, and the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree of the garden or any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Now, this is important to begin to understand who God is. Because before God gave us restriction, the tree in the garden, he gave us permission. You need to know this about God. That God created thousands and thousands of trees, all for their good, for their pleasure. It was wonderful, all this permission. I mean, the odds were stacked in Adam and Eve's favor. God did everything for their souls to flourish. That's the kind of God we serve. That's who God is. He's so for you. But then God put, not 10, one restriction. You may ask, well, why? Well, we don't have time to talk about part of the reason why. Is because God is a God of love. And love by definition requires a component of your will, a part of your will to be absolutely free. Because if you're not free to choose to love or choose not to love, by definition, that is not love, that is compliance. So in the beginning, because God is love and God is perfect by definition, he had to put a tree in the garden. But the other reason why he put a tree in the garden was for your soul, was for my soul. We need rest, we need responsibility, and we need restriction. And this is fairly self-explanatory. Because back to the work example, right? If somebody is over-identifying with work and they don't have energy when they're coming home, they don't have energy for the kids, they don't have energy to date because they're over-identifying, it's work, 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 it's like work is everything. You're like, would you be willing to say no? I mean, God created work, it's a wonderful thing, but you've got to have restriction within that. I mean, God created sex, and sex is a wonderful thing, but you've got to have restriction within sex. Because I don't need to give it examples. Perhaps you grew up in that example Where maybe your mom, your dad didn't have restriction when it came to sex. And as a result, a divorce happened. And as a result, confusion happened for you as a son, as a daughter. There's so many examples of that. When it comes to substances, it's like, hey, God created wonderful things, created food, created wine, created all these things for your enjoyment. But in a relationship, if there's no restriction, if there's no ability to say no, well, man, he's always numb. She's always numb. I wish I was like more relationally present with you, but there's just really no restriction over here when it comes to those substances. And it's just not you anymore. You're not present with me anymore. You see, restriction is so important for you and for me and for our souls to survive and for our relationships. I love what the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he gives us a principle that I think applies. He says, everything is permissible, but not everything's beneficial. Sure, you're free to do whatever you want. That's what God gave you. And you're far more free than perhaps you've been taught in church. But you can use your freedom for things that are beneficial and not beneficial. Guys, you've been on the other side of this. When somebody says no to the right things, says to their boss, hey, no, I'm only going to work 45 hours, 50 hours. I got to go home and be with my wife. I got to go home and be with my husband. I got to give them good energy. I got to give my kids good energy. There's so much value in those relationships, right? You've been on the other side of that perhaps, and what does that do to your marriage? What does that do to relationships? When somebody says, hey, let's enjoy 1 or 2 drinks, but that's it. When somebody says, hey, we're going to draw the line here on a moral boundary, aren't those wonderful? You feel so much more safe in that relationship. You feel so much more vulnerable in that relationship. Why? Restriction. Somebody said, hey, it's permissible to do whatever I want, but it's not beneficial. God designed your soul to rest, to have responsibility, and also for restriction. And last of all, the fourth thing to guide our souls is in the beginning, God said, oh, it's good, after he created all things. But then he looked over there and he's like, oh, but that thing over there, that's missing. There's something not good over there. What did he say was not good? The Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a suitable helper for him. Now, guys, I don't have to go into this, and I'm going to make this very, very short. I would encourage you to do your research on your own. But there's so much research and science to how you and I are designed to be connected, that human beings thrive when you are loved, when you are seen, when you are valued, when you are connected, not isolated, but with one another. That's where you thrive the very most, mentally, psychologically, physically, and relationally. And when it comes to your friends, when it comes to people that you have relationship with, it's not just any kind of relationship. You've got to be intentional. Because you may have heard it said this. You may have heard, hey, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. I would say when it comes to your soul, show me your friends and I'll show you the state of your soul. One of the things in my marriage relationship that Jill is so grateful for, that I have friends outside of our relationship that are good friends who know me and who love me and who can encourage me and laugh and have fun and rest with me, and can also say, hey, Buck, can we talk about some things that are going on over here? Hey, Buck, I see that you're not having a lot of fun. I see that it's about all work. There's not a lot of restrictions there. Hey, Buck, can we talk about that thing? That there's an iron sharpening iron piece of those relationships as well. Your soul needs that to thrive. So if I was to say to you, going forward, how is your soul? You now have a guide. You have something that can help you go, okay, I have a more comprehensive understanding of how to answer the question. And it's around these 4 things: rest, responsibility, restriction, and relationship. So here's the love handle. Here's the principle that I think is so fundamental and helpful for our relationships, is win your soul. And can I start there? Can we say with your soul, not your significant other? As I've been talking, if you've been thinking about, my wife, my husband, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, or that person that I may date. You're thinking about, well, they should hear this message. They should hear that part on rest. They should hear that part on restriction, right? I'm just telling you, blame is lame. It will keep things the same. You got to turn that part of your brain off. You really do. I'm just telling you, I love you. I'm for you. But that part of your brain, the more you blame, the more, if she would, if he would, if you would, I'm just telling you, one of the things I've learned after 47 years of life, you want to keep your love relationships kind of on the same or maybe a downward plane, then just keep blaming. Just keep telling yourself it's him or her. It starts with you. as I said to my son, Michael, one of the greatest gifts you could give yourself in your future love relationships is you, the healthiest version of you. So the principle says, when your soul is good, your love relationships are good. It's a principle. And the question we've got to be willing to ask and at least consider, that I want you to consider this week, maybe ask a friend to ask you this, or bring it in a small group, or put it on your phone somewhere, is to ask the question, how's your soul? How's my soul? So how is your soul? Are you resting well? If I ask you the question, hey, what do you do for fun? Do you have to think about it and go, well, it's like, I don't know. Well, perhaps that's an indicator that your soul needs some rest. Do you need to take a nap? Do you need to go on a walk? Do you need to cease from doing the necessary because you got to control everything? Your soul will thrive and God will work when you trust him and you rest. How's your soul when it comes to responsibility? Are there any responsibilities that you know that you're just kind of stepping back from? That you know you should step into that responsibility? You see it before your very eyes, but you're not leaning in and accepting, you're rejecting it. You're being passive with it. It'll have a direct impact on your soul, which has a direct impact on your relationships. When it comes to restriction, how's your soul? Are there any lines that you know that are coming at a cost? That you're not fully present with your kids. You're not fully present with your boyfriend or girlfriend. You're not fully present with your husband or your wife. Because there's something that, yes, it brings pleasure. Yes, it's permissible. You're free. But you're not saying no to the right things. And last of all, how's your soul when it comes to relationships? Are there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people outside of your marriage, outside of your dating relationship that just gets you, that accept you, that you feel safe with, that you can be vulnerable with, that can encourage you and cheer you on, and you can go have a beer or a glass of wine or some fine food or go on a walk or whatever it may be, and that can also look at you and say, as iron sharpens iron, hey, can we talk about your soul? Can we talk about your rest? Can we talk about your responsibility? I'm here for you. I'm not here to be against you. Those relationships are critical because that gives you security. That allows you to have your identity firm on a good foundation. That allows you to be more patient and more humble. That allows you to be far more curious. And all those things and so much more from a healthy soul are the components of what allows a love relationship to thrive. That's what God so desires for you and what I do as well. So one last time, how's your soul? How's your soul? Let me pray for us. God, thanks so much for this moment that we can talk about this. This is a lot to think about, and you're fully aware of this. And so, Father, I pray for all of us that as we think about these words, as we think about our souls, we think about these 4 things, would you give us the self-awareness, the courage, the bravery to take a step in one of these areas, to give a gift to ourselves and a gift to our love relationships. And then would you just give us the courage, the grit, the tenacity, the reminders, the gentleness that only comes from you to actually do something different. We love you, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next week.